is going to sound insane to some people, but I swear it's not affected, I'm not making it up, I'm being 100% deadly serious when I tell you that Assassin's Creed is really important to me. It's one of those things for me where, you know, it's not just that you love it, it's that loving it is almost foundational to you. It's part of your story. It's like loving a football team or Star Trek or being Welsh. Only two of those apply to me. I was having a conversation with my wife Alice recently about Assassin's Creed being 15 years old and how decrepit that made me feel. And we realised in that conversation that we could both remember exactly where we were and what we were doing the first time we saw Assassin's Creed, the first time we became aware of it. Alice glimpsed it on her brother's TV as she walked past his room one day in 2007. He was just playing it on his PS3 and it was so distinctive, so polished and curated looking. You could see the money and the talent just radiating off the screen. She had to go in and start a conversation because she'd never seen anything quite like it before. And as they were talking about it, their dad did the same thing, also walked past and had to go in and strike up the same conversation because it just had that allure. I remember working in a call centre around the time that first trailer dropped from E3 in 2006, I think it was, where you see Accra and the eagle and a hooded figure making a kill before disappearing into the crowd. I'd been massively out of touch with video game news by that point. I loved video games, but I was content to just sit at home on my rubbish PC and play Morrowind at 27 frames a second or something like that. But despite that, I found myself drawn to this crowd of 20-something guys who were all stood around a colleague's monitor watching this trailer, and we were all like, shit, this is next gen. Is this what the new games look like? Man, I gotta sort that out for myself. And so I did. I spent months saving up for an Xbox 360, which was like a big deal for me back then because I didn't have any money. I went into a shop, I got a 360, Assassin's Creed was the first game I bought for it, and it was the only game I had for months. And I was blown away, and I've been absolutely in love with the series ever since. The point is that every now and then, something comes along and becomes this cultural juggernaut that seems to in some way set the blueprint for everything that comes after it, that leaves traces of itself in the numerous works it inspires for years afterwards, whether that's because it's full of good ideas that get nicked and remixed ad infinitum, or because it gets so drearily popular that creators relish the idea of veering wildly away from it. Assassin's Creed is one of those things. It's gaming's equivalent of something like Lost or Game of Thrones, where yes, they're deeply flawed and there's always someone who sneers at them whenever they come up in conversation, but even that person can't deny the sheer impact they've had on the media landscape, the amount of copycats they inspired, the tropes they established, the careers they launched. I would like to point out before we move on that Assassin's Creed has never shat the bed to the extent that Game of Thrones and Lost did. It hasn't yet, anyway. It arrived as part of a grand lineage of historically inspired action-adventure games that goes all the way back to Prince of Persia on the Apple II. Indeed, Assassin's Creed started life as a spin-off of that series. You can see elements of it surviving to this day. Rotoscoped fencing was 1989's cutting-edge equivalent of today's performance-captured combat system. You can quite easily argue that Assassin's Creed takes a lot of inspiration from Tomb Raider as well, as does anything that involves a lot of climbing walls, exploring old ruins, and barely discriminate murder. Assassin's Creed wears its influences on its sleeve. There's no denying how derivative it is. It's an open-world Prince of Persia game with Tomb Raider's traversal, Medal of Honor's historical realism, Hitman's hide-in-plain-sight stealth system, the convoluted deep lore cinematic presentation and twisting meta-narrative of Metal Gear Solid. If you look at the state of play in 2007, Assassin's Creed was essentially video games the video game. It's even got a bit of Grand Theft Auto in there. But like all the best things in life, whether they're video games, films, TV shows, novels, albums, countries, Assassin's Creed is so much more than the sum of its parts, and it is, for my money, the birth of the modern AAA video game. Sometimes it feels like everything is an Assassin's Creed derivative now, from Lord of the Rings to Spider-Man. The Ubisoft template of open-world action game has become, for better or worse, ubiquitous. It's even bled back into Tomb Raider and the sorts of action-adventure games that used to be entirely linear, but now have loads of wide open areas to explore and to do side stuff in. And it starts right here with the first Assassin's Creed, climbing towers to defog the map and unlock side activities that advance your progress and character abilities, investigative gameplay that relies on some kind of sixth sense, whether through supernatural means or a Batman-style detective mode. There's even something Assassin's Creedy about the entire AAA look now, a sort of softly lit naturalism with an emphasis on intricate detail that stays just on the larger-than-life side of the uncanny valley, enough for it to remain unmistakably a video game. It never looks weird, even if you're fighting a giant mythical wolf or you've just triggered a mad physics bug. And yet, it's real enough for you to have no trouble empathizing with the characters. I mean, maybe I'm doing a bit of boss baby here and just projecting Assassin's Creed into everything. Maybe it's that the Ubisoft catalogue and Sony's first-party output account for a massive percentage of the AAA space, and they're basically all the same fucking game. But what I'm getting at is that it does feel like there was a time before Assassin's Creed, and then a time after. In the same way that there was a time before The Witcher 3 and then a time after. The Witcher 3 is another example of a seminal game that seemed to just leave its mark on everything that came after it, including, as it happens, Assassin's Creed, which, as we all know, reinvented itself as a Witcher 3 style RPG a few years back and just seems to have kept ballooning ever since. It's all part of the same cycle of reinvention and reinterpretation, and outright theft, which, if you love the medium of video games and find it fascinating on an academic level, at the risk of sounding pretentious, the first Assassin's Creed game is so interesting because it's full of mad contradictions. It spawned a flagship series that is one of the best-selling video game franchises of all time. The amount of money it's made is obscene, and yet everyone thinks the first game is a load of shit. It's slow, it's boring, the parkour's really irritating, the combat's too easy, the writing is a load of vague quasi-philosophical guff about the illusion of free will.
It must be knowledge that frees them, not force.
They do not learn, fixed in their ways as they are.
The accepted wisdom, and it's accepted because it's correct, is that Assassin's Creed was a disappointing game that had a load of brilliant sequels. Quite a lot of shit sequels as well, but let's not muddy the narrative. It's true that the first game feels very unrefined compared to later games in the series. Altair is often quite unwieldy as a character and never quite goes where you want him to. There's an emphasis on repetitive activities, eavesdropping, pickpocketing, flag collecting, saving the citizen, etc. The systems often clash in unpredictable ways. You're trying to tail someone in order to beat some information out of them, but there's a fucking beggar who won't leave you alone, and unlike the sequel, there's no mechanism for giving them money, so in addition to being frustrated, you also just feel bad. But putting all that aside, what's remarkable about playing the first game now in 2022, 15 years and Christ knows how many sequels, spin-offs, comics, tie-in novels, short films and long films later, is about how fully formed Assassin's Creed was when it arrived. Even when you compare it to the latest games, it is unmistakably the same thing. People often forget that the first game had a vast kingdom map where you could explore on horseback a landscape that was pockmarked with peasant villages and Roman ruins. Sounds familiar. It's not a full-fat RPG like the most recent games, but it is a game where you unlock new equipment over time and can increase your character's hit points or sync bar by performing extracurricular activities. The supernatural elements of the story, which a lot of people misremember as coming later, are set up in this game. There's a very clear line from Apples of Eden to battering Cyclopses. It might not be as in-depth, it might not be as refined, but the basic framework of an Assassin's Creed game is all there, present and correct. Every game since has been a remix of elements that were always here. Yes, even the pirate ship you get in Black Flag is basically an elaborate combination of horse and bureau. So the first game doesn't get enough credit for establishing the strong foundation that its much more celebrated sequel, Assassin's Creed 2, was able to build on so successfully. It seems like such an obvious thing to say, and yet I feel like people do forget that there is no Assassin's Creed 2 without Assassin's Creed. There is no Ezio, there is no Black Flag, there is no Cassandra, there is no lavish recreation of classical Greece, Ptolemaic Egypt, or revolutionary Paris. It's fundamental. Altair walked so Ivor could freerun. And if you've never partaken of the first game, this is the perfect time to try it out. Chronologically, disregarding the modern day story, which everyone does anyway, it comes a few centuries after Valhalla in the timeline, bringing the series full circle. Most of the other games have an element of rebuilding the Assassin's Brotherhood after they've been all but wiped out, but the first game is fairly unique in that it depicts the Assassins at the absolute height of their power, at a time when they still had regional offices in every major city and their headquarters was a gigantic mountain fortress in Syria, Masyaf Castle, which is a real place which really was home to the Assassin's Brotherhood, an Islamic sect who lived in the mountains and played a prominent role in the Crusades, as did their leader, the Old Man of the Mountain, who is depicted in Assassin's Creed as Altair's mentor, Al-Mualim. And this is a good place to mention the other thing that the first game doesn't get anywhere near enough credit for, namely the fact that its protagonist isn't a wisecracking white guy or a big buff white guy or a white woman. Altair is from the Middle East and he's canonically a Muslim. Some of his dialogue suggests that his religious faith might have lapsed, and let's be clear about this, Assassin's Creed makes a very conspicuous, you might say cowardly choice not to actually talk about the religious element of the Crusades, which is a bit like not talking about the petroleum element of an internal combustion engine. Regardless, having an Arabic, heavily implied to be Muslim man be the hero of a AAA video game in 2007 was, I think, a brave choice at a time when, I probably don't need to remind you all, Islamophobia was shamefully rife in the West. And it still is. And it really shouldn't be brave or notable to make your main character a Middle Eastern man. But I do think it's an important thing to remember in the context of the time. Now, obviously, Assassin's Creed depicts a heavily fictionalized version of the Crusades, and as mentioned, doesn't really go into the central conflict, preferring instead to relegate the Holy War to a sort of backdrop to the ideological conflict between Assassins and Templars that characterizes the series to this day. Kind of, I mean, fuck knows what the last game's even about if I'm being honest. Even so, the main draw of the series is its sense of historical realism. History is our playground, so goes the marketing slogan, and it's a brilliant one because it really distills Assassin's Creed down to a single sentence elevator pitch that describes its entire appeal. I didn't really pay much attention to history before I played Assassin's Creed, but I distinctly remember googling the fortress at Masyaf to see if it was real or made up, and upon discovering it was real, it dawned on me that history is fascinating. I mean, yeah, it's fun to run around stabbing people in a dramatized simulation of it, but Assassin's Creed's commitment to featuring painstakingly researched historical realism as a hyper-detailed backdrop to its ongoing story about goodies and baddies fighting across time is something that I credit with enriching my life. It made me realise that I love learning about the past, and I'm not the smartest person in the room and I've got a shit memory, so don't get me wrong, I'd never describe myself as an amateur historian or anything so fucking twee, but what I do know is that since getting into Assassin's Creed I've inhaled loads of books written by academics, podcasts, documentaries, you name it. I've even discovered something about myself in that I have a favourite period of history to read about, and it is precisely the bit where the Romans checked out of Britain and civilization collapsed because the Brits just couldn't hack it without Continentals running things for them, and I find that idea endlessly captivating and, if I'm being honest, quite funny. So, as an aside, when Valhalla came out and it was set 400 years after the Romans left Britain and the land was pockmarked with a load of Roman ruins depicting the 9th century as a sort of post-apocalyptic vision of the Dark Ages, which it probably was, I felt like they'd made that for me. And I guess that's the power of a really strong idea, a solid foundation on which to build a cultural artwork. People feel like they own it. People feel like it's worth investing their time, money, and emotional labour into it because the rewards can be so profound and go way beyond the thing itself. Assassin's Creed has given me a lot. You wouldn't believe it. Hundreds of hours of entertainment, yes, but also lifelong friendships, Haloes, interests that I never knew I had, and subsequently, I hope, a much more informed understanding of the world than I would have had otherwise. I wouldn't have a career if it wasn't for Assassin's Creed. If I didn't save up for that 360 all those years ago and start a podcast with my mate Richie and that whole life story that I'm sure you quite rightly don't give a shit about hearing, I wouldn't be sitting here saying this into a microphone and paying my mortgage with it. I guess what I'm trying to say at the end of the day, in all sincerity, is that Assassin's Creed runs in 4K at 60 frames a second on the Series X, and it looks fucking banging. So, what else do you want? I've been Jim Trinker for VG247, and you should definitely like and subscribe, because if you don't, you smell. Check out the website, check out the podcast, check it all out. Check it out like it's Supermarket Sweet, man. I'll speak to you later.